And welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's session of our fall series on dangerous ideas, censorship through a Jewish lens. I want to especially welcome anyone joining us for the first time today, and all of the previous sessions are online, and I think you've received a link to the series page in your confirmation email. Today we begin not one but two sessions on probably the most famous case in the broad realm of censorship in Jewish history, the one that we've already gotten many questions about in the chat so far in all our previous sessions. So we begin Spinoza today. And we're so happy to have JTS alum, Dr. Jonathan Ray, who is the Samuel Agg Professor of Jewish Studies at Georgetown University, teaching us. And Dr. Ray has taught for us before, always with great success, as some of you know, who've been learning with us for a couple of years now. So thank you so much, Dr. Ray, for teaching us today again. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors for today. We have two Chacham level sponsors, Beatrice and Harold Jacobson, JTS trustee. Thank you so much for your generous sponsorship. And Berna and Bill Haberman and Rona Solberg for sponsoring in memory of their parents, Sutel and Samuel Bernstein. Thank you so much, Berna and Bill and Rona, and we're pleased to have the learning today in your parents' memory. And we also hope that that your generosity will inspire your fellow learners to consider sponsoring a session as well. We have three sponsorship levels, Chacham, Sadiq, and Navi, for $540, $1,000, and $1,800 respectively. And these sponsorships are what make this series happen. So thank you so much. I would like to now turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman to share a bit more information with you.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So I'll just review the format of our session. Dr. Ray will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll have some time for a Q&A at the end of the class as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. And during the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Professor Ray. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Jonathan Ray, the Samuel Agg Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Ray earned his PhD in Jewish history from JTS. Professor Ray specializes in medieval and early modern Jewish history, focusing on Sephardic Jews. His forthcoming book, Jewish Life in Medieval Spain, A New History, illuminates interfaith relations in Spain from the Jewish perspective. He has also written several other books, which you can learn more about in his full bio, which we included with the sources for today's session. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Ray.
Okay, I'll make sure that I'm unmuted for everybody. Welcome. It's a joy to be here, albeit virtually, with all of you this afternoon, and to speak a little bit about this question of Jewish censorship and really broaden our aperture a little bit to look at Jewish society in general and the way in which questions of censorship play out, among other issues such as Jewish power, Jewish politics, Jewish communal relations, etc. So today our topic is the very famous and provocative career of Benedictus or Baruch Spinoza. The fact that he has double names gives us a little bit of insight into his character, into his family background. Spinoza comes from a Sephardic background of former conversos, of a family that was originally Jewish, forced to convert to Catholicism, lived as Catholics in Portugal for a while before the family moved from the Iberian Peninsula to the Netherlands, where eventually they revert openly to Judaism once again. So when we talk about Spinoza being censored and eventually excommunicated from the Jewish community in one of the most well-known and infamous excommunications of a major figure in Jewish history, he and his family had not been part of the Jewish community for quite some time. They'd only been recently brought back into the Jewish community. So that was a part of the story that I think we should probably investigate first. So as was already mentioned, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to Spinoza and the Amsterdam Jewish community in the 17th century. And then we can sort of pause for some questions about that background before we get into the work of Spinoza himself. But even before we get into his personal and communal history, I think there's a couple points that we should keep in mind as we go throughout this afternoon. Now, as many of you know, thoughtful debates on the many aspects of Judaism have long been part of Jewish religious and intellectual life. Many of us were taught you're supposed to question, you're supposed to push each other to understand the text more profoundly. But it's important to remember a couple of things. One, not everything is up for debate. While we like to think of Judaism as a religion that inquires and presses, not everything is necessarily up for debate. And equally important, not everyone cherishes debate and dissension. I think very often American Jews very proudly wear this mantle of, in our religion, we don't just, take things by rote, we question things, we push each other. Some members of the Jewish community are more in favor of that dissent than others. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, rather than just say, well, as Jews, we don't mind questioning. Some Jews mind questioning and have in every generation. So that's a leitmotif that plays throughout Jewish history that it's worth recalling, and not to just assume that all Jews love a good argument. It's not necessarily the case. So let's set the scene here. 17th century Holland was a land of great economic opportunity for Jews as well as for other people, but it was also a place of great and intense religious ferment. Those of you who know a little bit about Dutch history, the 17th century is really part of the Dutch Golden Age. It's the period of great art, of great wealth, as Amsterdam in particular becomes a major cosmopolitan center, a center of intellectual life, a center of trade, really the great entrepot of Northern Europe of the day in many ways. And so it brought to it Jews as well as others looking to take advantage of this burgeoning economic and intellectual center. Among those Jews, there's a particular subset of Jews who find Amsterdam particularly attractive, and that is the Sephardic Jews who were formerly conversos. Without going into a whole history of what that term means, the conversos were a group of Jews from Spain originally, who were forcibly converted or converted under duress towards the end of the Middle Ages in the late 14th throughout the 15th century. Many of them converted to Catholicism and stayed as Catholics, and many people in Spain today are the descendants of those conversos, those converted Jews. Others were converted, eventually left Spain and the Iberian Peninsula and reverted to Judaism in places like Amsterdam, or Italy, or North Africa, or the Ottoman Empire. But there was another group of Jews in Spain who were exiled by royal decree in 1492, who had never been converted. They were the relatives of those, the neighbors, the community members of those people who were converted, but they themselves had remained Jews, had resisted all sorts of pressures to convert to Catholicism. And it wasn't until the king and queen expelled them in 1492 that the Jews, somewhat with a heavy heart, decided to leave Spain. The choice of remaining but converting to Catholicism was not one they chose. They chose to remain Jewish instead and went into exile from their ancestral homeland, but retained their religious identity. Many of those Spanish Jews crossed the border into neighboring Portugal in 1492. Only to be forcibly converted by royal decree in the Kingdom of Portugal in 1497. And so these two moments of conversion, one that took place in Spain over a longer period of time for a variety of different reasons, and one that happened really all at once by royal decree in 1497 in Portugal, are part of the background to the Spinoza story. Whether or not members of his family were originally from Spain, it's hard to say. A large number of Jews did leave Spain, as I said, and went to Portugal, but there was an already existing strong and important Portuguese Jewish community there that welcomed these Spanish Jews in the 1490s, and they blended with them. And in 1497, when all of Portuguese Jewry is converted, it's not quite clear from that moment forward always. Sometimes we have information, but it's not always clear which of those Jews in the combined Spanish-Portuguese community had Spanish roots and which ones had Portuguese roots. We know that Spinoza's family was a Portuguese-speaking Catholic family with Jewish roots that eventually makes its way to Amsterdam and there reverts to Judaism. And the Amsterdam in which these conversos found home was one that was both a promised land of sorts for these people wishing to return to Judaism, but also one that presented a variety of other problems. For instance, the Netherlands had fairly recently converted mostly to a form of Protestant Christianity, a form of that later becomes the Dutch Reformed Church, a form of sort of Calvinism. And this was good news for those people fleeing Catholicism because the Protestants didn't care if you were Protestant or Jewish per se. Well, they cared. They would prefer you to be Protestant, but they allowed for people to be Jewish. They were more interested that you not be Catholic. In Catholic countries, a Catholic reverting to their ancestral faith of Judaism was a no-no, right? If you're caught doing that in Italy, you could be severely punished. But the Protestants didn't care if someone shows up one day as a Catholic and then openly embraces Judaism. That for them is all right. But having said that, that doesn't mean that Protestants and these newly reverted Jews were on the best of terms necessarily. There was a little bit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But beyond that, there were still somewhat strained relations. The same authorities for whom openly tolerant personal religious expressions were okay, were not necessarily welcoming of all open religious expression. They drew a line there that shouldn't be crossed. At the time Spinoza was born, conservative elements within the Dutch Calvinist Church had just won a major victory over a faction known as the Remonstrants, or the more progressive wing of the church. And the conservative victors continued to allow Judaism to be observed in their territory, but sent a clear message that the leaders of all religious communities, including Jews, should enforce a strict orthodoxy, and that theologians and other potential free thinkers should be held in check. So, on the one hand, if you were someone who was forced to observe Catholicism, here was a place you could throw off that mantle of false Catholicism and embrace Judaism of your ancestors once more, but with conditions. You, as a Jewish community, had to uphold what your form of orthodoxy was. You couldn't have a whole lot of dissent within your ranks. You had to run a tight ship, and your theologians, your rabbis, your intellectuals could not embrace this sort of free thinking that was becoming popular in the Protestant church at the time. That was a message that was sent quite clearly by the new Protestant authorities to the Jewish authorities. And I say that because when someone like Spinoza comes along, the Jewish authorities are not going to only perhaps take offense at some of his theology, at some of his ideas about God, because it contradicted their own, but there was an awareness that upstarts like him could be bad for all Jews. And they had been charged by the Christians in power to keep a lid on people like Spinoza. So that's something to keep in mind. Moreover, a fear of upsetting local Christian rulers was also a long-standing concern among Jewish governing boards. a concern that was no doubt enhanced by the precarious state of Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam. They had just arrived. It wasn't quite sure how long they'd be able to stay. And if they were kicked out of there, there was a very short list of places that would accept them. So the Ma'amad, or the governing council of the Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam, was very much aware of these issues of political ferment in the non-Jewish community. They were aware of their own precarious nature. And moreover, that Ma'amad was not dominated by great rabbis per se, but by great merchants and bankers who referred to rabbinic experts when necessary to strengthen their own matters in communal government, but very much saw the religious leaders as support for business and not the other way around. These lay leaders, or parnasim as they're often called, issued decrees of herem, or excommunication, dozens of times during the 17th century, and formally threatened others with the ban dozens more times. And so when we take a look at the state of affairs in Amsterdam Jewry in the 17th century, it was one where the leaders were mostly lay people, not rabbis. They were leaders who were dedicated to keeping the wheels of commerce rolling and spinning. And they used religious herem. They brought in religious leaders to strengthen their hand when they proclaimed these decrees of excommunication. Quite often, this was a favored tool for keeping people in line by the parnasim of the Sephardic community of Amsterdam in the 17th century. That didn't always go over well with religious leaders. The great rabbi and philosopher Manasseh ben Israel, who was a member of the community, once issued a sharp rebuke of that sort of behavior, arguing that only a rabbi had the authority to pronounce the herem. But his protest is instructive. Rather than just say, you see, rabbis could push back against the parnasim. In fact, his pushback did not do a whole lot of good for him. The parnasim viewed him as little more than an annoyance. They responded by excommunicating Ben Israel for a day as a warning, giving a localized herem and a threat that more would continue if he ever dared raise his voice against the governing council again. And so when we talk about the Jews of Amsterdam and who was in control, it's quite clear, despite luminaries like Manasseh ben Israel, and as we'll see, like Baruch Spinoza, government was fairly firmly in the hand of these great merchants and bankers, and not the rabbis per se. Before we go on, maybe we should take a pause there and see if anyone has any questions regarding this background, and then we can move on a little bit more preparing for our text.
Thank you. Someone was, okay, they're coming in. How large was the Jewish community in Amsterdam at the time?
It's hard to say, but let's say 1,000 Jews. I'll give you a nice round number, and people are coming and going, and as we'll see in a minute, hard to know who's a Jew sometimes and who's a Catholic, but generally speaking, 1,000.
I'm so glad for that question, because it's, we imagine these historical communities that we know so much about, and like that's the size of one not particularly big shul around here.
Right.
It's helpful to remember the scale was totally different. Someone also asked why his family, why did they revert back to Judaism? Do we know?
The short answer is we never know exactly why someone decides to revert back to Judaism. The argument generally goes for religious reasons, because they believe this is the religion they would want to live in, and they would have they and their ancestors would never have left that religion unless they were forced to do so. That's the rabbi answer. How much of that decision was fostered by the fact that as a Jewish merchant in Amsterdam, they could do better than as a Catholic merchant in Lisbon at that particular time? That's harder to say, right? We do have evidence of some of these Portuguese Catholics moving to places like Hamburg and London and Amsterdam, to mention some of the important Protestant cities in which someone could revert to Judaism. and they didn't revert, right? So we do have examples of Portuguese Catholics of Jewish heritage who decide to leave for business reasons, leave for these places where there's big business, and not revert to Judaism. Was that because Judaism ceased to be important to them? Was it because they felt it was, but they were still a little bit scared? It's hard to know. It's hard to know the motivating forces, especially when in some of these families, you'll have a brother who revert to Judaism and another brother or sister not. So the short answer would be they chose to embrace the religion that they felt was their truest expression of religious identity. It helped to do it in a place where it wasn't that difficult to be a Jew.
Great. And just a couple demographic questions. Were there Ashkenazi Jews here as well, or just Sephardim? And were there a lot of conversos? Sort of what's the where do we find this family against the backdrop of the community? And someone also said, were they excommunicating a lot of people, or was this an unusual thing?
Right. So as I said, the writ of excommunication, which we can get into a little bit later in more detail, was issued dozens of times in his lifetime. So that it was not that unpopular a thing. It was, however, seen as a cudgel. In other words, this was not, you're excommunicated, you're dead to me, you'll never be part of the Jewish community, but often it was considered to be something that you would use as a threat, repent or else. And even after the fact, as we saw with Rabbi Ben Israel, we're going to excommunicate you for a day. And that's a warning. So the obvious use of it was to force people to heal, to force them to behave, not necessarily to kick them out of the community forever. Although with Spinoza, some people decided, fine, I'm going to take my ball and go home. I'm going to leave the community forever. That's the answer to that last part of the question. As far as the makeup of the community, so the Sephardic conversos, later Jews, were among the first to really establish the new Jewish community in Amsterdam. Spinoza dies in the 1670s. By that time, you already see an Ashkenazi community of German and Polish Jews who have begun to arrive in the city, as well as in Antwerp and other cities nearby. They were the smaller of the two communities and by far the less wealthy and powerful of the two communities, but already in Spinoza's lifetime, you see the beginnings of an Ashkenazi community joining the earlier Sephardic community in Amsterdam. So too with Sephardic Jews who did not have any conversos in their family. So there are Jews who leave Spain in 1492, don't go to Portugal, never get converted, end up in the Venetian ghetto or in the Ottoman Empire or other places, and then find their way to Amsterdam in the 17th century. So you have some Sephardic Jews who had never been conversos, some Ashkenazi Jews who, of course, had never been conversos. But I think the founding fathers and really the driving force of the community at this time were Portuguese former converso Jews.
Got it. Okay, we have so many more questions coming in. I think we should actually, I think I'm going to hold them, and so you can return the material, and probably some of them will be answered.
Yeah, and we also will have a Q&A at the end of the whole talk, so fear not, there will be more time to handle questions. So just as there was a local atmosphere of religious orthodoxy in Amsterdam and a real push towards Jewish orthodoxy being strengthened by trends like that in the Christian community, there was also a great tradition of conservative government among the Sephardim that goes back long before any Protestants threatened them to keep a tighter ship, right? Throughout the Middle Ages, both in Spain and Portugal, Jewish communal government tended to be quite conservative. It tended to be run by a small group of families. Those Parnasim posts were handed down very often from father to son. There were some examples of families, Arivist families, working their way from poverty up into the upper echelons of the Jewish community in a local city, and from there becoming part of the political leadership. But that was actually rare, and it was something that the great families tried as best they could to control. So we can't just say that, well, the Jews were very scared of the backlash against them from the Protestants if they didn't keep their own Jews in line. There's a great love of keeping people in line that runs throughout the Jewish community. So we can look at sort of two great countervailing poles within Jewish history, Jewish political history, one of law and order and of wealth and of orthodoxy, and one of a more obstreperous trend of people outside orthodoxy, outside the mainstream, outside the oligarchy, pushing against the people in power and trying to keep them honest, so to say. So these two trends exist even before the 17th century in the Sephardic Jewish world in particular. Okay. So this brings up this question of young Spinoza and what exactly happened that got him censured. Spinoza was only 23 years old when he was excommunicated from the community in Amsterdam in July of 1656. So it's not particularly a form of censorship per se, for he didn't really publish his great works. And it wasn't that he published his book, they read his book, and they pulled them out of his house and asked him to remove these things, but rather he was someone who was, at a young age, he's only 23, becoming known for ideas that ran counter to the established orthodoxies of the day. And I use orthodoxy here, not in the modern sense of the Orthodox community. If you belong to a modern Orthodox shul, that's not what I'm talking about. This is orthodoxy with a small o, the conservative line of Jewish thought at the time. So it wasn't really for censorship per se that Spinoza is attacked, but rather for his lecturing on and his general teaching of ideas that would later find fame in his published works that were to come out after his cherem from the Jewish community. And among them is that he is very much influenced by a spiritual teacher of his. He didn't sit with him, but he was a great fan of the work of René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher who had died a few years earlier in 1650. And his innovative approach to metaphysics were causing a stir in both the Christian and Jewish community. If you were sort of a young intellectual in a cosmopolitan center in Northern Europe, as was Spinoza, you would read Descartes and you would form some of an opinion. Are we on board with the Cartesian view of God and the universe, or are we not? Or are we more traditional? Descartes and his works were being banned left and right throughout Holland and throughout Northern Europe. Some people were embracing him. Others saw that his influence was very dangerous and his works were being censored themselves. So declaring yourself a fan of Cartesian philosophy and thought was something that would definitely get the attention of the authorities, right? We think today that perhaps it's the popular music lyrics that we have to worry about for our kids. In the 17th century, Jews perhaps worried about their kids reading Descartes and being influenced by that kind of stuff. And one of the aspects of Cartesian thought that sort of influences young Spinoza is in his redefinition of the nature of God. And I use that word somewhat, ironically. For Spinoza, God really was nature, or akin to natural processes. In his ethics, which we're not going to read here today, he's often saying things like Deus sive natura. The book is published in Latin, and it comes out to mean something like God, that is to say, or by that I mean nature. So for Spinoza, God cannot perform miracles, and God cannot plan or judge anything. God doesn't have human qualities like judgment or mercy, but rather God is, for Spinoza, those natural processes that shoot throughout the universe. And any notion that God acts for a reason, that God plans to do something and therefore does something, is nothing more than a human projection. That's human language that we use trying to understand God, and it's inherently problematic for him. God is nature, And nature has no set purpose. It has just necessary processes that unfold. So God cannot be obeyed. God cannot be placated. God cannot punish. That's not, for Spinoza, the nature of God. God is, in fact, something that is woven into the universe as sort of inherent bedrock properties of the universe, but not with any of these sort of human qualities. That already is something that you can imagine would be upsetting not only to Jews of the time, but to Catholics and Protestants alike. Spinoza comes out and says that the anthropomorphized God of the Bible is fictional. It's a human invention. Or, as he puts it in some of the writing we saw today, and that we'll go into today, it's human beings doing their best to try to describe God in human language. Okay, but God doesn't have any human properties. And the notion that God does is a human fiction. As such, there is a difference between divine law, which we might say are universal metaphysical properties, and the kind of laws and dictates and commandments we see in the Bible. The ceremonial or religious law, the stuff that eventually becomes halacha in the lived tradition of the Jews, is something very different than in the natural properties on which they're supposedly based. And Spinoza is very clear that we shouldn't be worried so much about the technicalities of daily law. They are perhaps necessary for the smooth running of a community, but this is not something, someone violating halacha is not violating God's will in any sort of deep way, but rather violating a sort of social construct that probably didn't exist 100 years ago and may not exist 100 years hence. That was not something that the more conservative elements within the Jewish community greeted with great happiness back in the 17th century. But you can imagine there are certain members of the Jewish community, then as now, that perk up when they hear this. They said, so I don't have to sweat the small stuff. I'm not doomed to eternal damnation, or I'm not going to be kept out of Olam Haba, the world to come, just because I violated some of these what I consider to be smaller issues of Jewish practice. Spinoza says, yes, I wouldn't worry so much about that. And that is something that really has won him fans throughout history within the Jewish community, as a matter of fact, as well as won him many enemies in the Jewish community in his own day. So I want to stop now, if we can, and take a look at the text we have for today, which is a selection from one of his most famous works, his theological political treatise, chapter 3 of that treatise, which is going to be shared with us now. Thank you very much, Tani, for sharing this on our screen with us. So some of you had a chance to read this beforehand, and I'm not going to read through every bit of it, but I want to highlight a few aspects of it that I think give us some sense of how this might be received in Amsterdam in the days of Spinoza. Now, I said this came out after his excommunication from the Jewish community, but these ideas were most likely those that he was became associated with before the book was even published. So this was sort of a preemptive censorship after some of the people in the community got wind of some of these ideas and that he was going to publish them, first of all. And second of all, and this is not completely unrelated, publish them in Latin, publish them not just in Hebrew, publish them in Latin. This Tractatus Theologico Politica was a Latin treatise that was aimed at a larger European audience than just European Jews. So when Spinoza makes these statements, as somewhat blasphemous as they might have been seen within the Jewish community, there was also a sense of he's saying this about us to everybody. He's saying this out there for all Catholic and Protestant theologians and heads of state to read, as well as just for the Jewish community. So this goes back to that earlier comment I said, while in the Jewish world, we like to think of ourselves as very open to discussion and even sort of heated debate. There is a notion, I'm going to switch from the Sephardi to the Ashkenazi world here, of shanda for the goyim, that you can argue certain things, you can do certain acts, but perhaps only in-house. Let's keep that in the yeshiva. We don't want to do things that embarrass us in front of, or make us look bad in front of the larger society. And this, I think, would fall into the category of not only things that a lot of the Jews at this time did not want to hear, but certainly didn't want to be made public, didn't want this to be a front-facing view of the Jewish community that one of their up-and-coming young intellectuals was going to show. And so let's start here at the very beginning. Like I said, we're not going to read the whole chapter at this time, but it's instructive to start at this beginning to give a sense of where Spinoza is heading. He writes, everyone's true happiness and blessedness consists solely in the enjoyment of good, not in priding himself that he alone is enjoying that good to the exclusion of others. This really sets up the theme of this chapter, which is there's nothing particularly special about the Jews, right? As he follows in the next sentence, he who counts himself more blessed because he alone enjoys well-being not shared by others, or because he is more blessed and fortunate than others, knows not what is true happiness and blessedness, and the joy he derives therefrom, if it be not mere childishness, has its only source in spite and malice. You Jews who think you are chosen, and you think that chosenness means that God loves you more than God loves others, that God sees you as more important than others, that you as a people are an elite people among the other peoples, the other nations of the world, is nothing but human malice and spite. The notion that you think that God loves you more, treats you better, has chosen you for things that others are not chosen for, really misses the point of religion. And there are a variety of reasons why this is hard to hear. Anyone in a position of religious authority from any religion would maybe raise an eyebrow here, because at that time, as is still the case in much of the world today, lots of people tend to think, I believe my religion is not only the right religion, but really right to the exclusion of others. Not, I believe my religion is wonderful, I believe my neighbor's religion is wonderful. They're all paths to the same mountaintop. What was the dominant thought then, as it is in many precincts still today, is that no, nothing against anyone else, but there is one correct religion and it's mine. And to hear that that's not necessarily true, that no group really has the exclusive rights to God's favor, is something that raised eyebrows across the boards, but particularly in Spinoza's own community. There's another reason, too, why this is considered to be particularly problematic for Jews. Then as now, in the debate among religions as to how can you argue that your religion is right and my religion is wrong, the Jews tended to hold the position that they were sort of the few and the proud. They couldn't point to world domination. They couldn't point to a long history of successful proselytizing. Christians had really controlled the entire European world for centuries, and the Muslims had controlled the North African and Middle Eastern world for centuries. The world in which Jews lived, they were always minorities among either Muslim or Christian societies. How then do they tell their children that Judaism is still correct? The argument is that God chose us above others for a special destiny. We are not the biggest, we are not the most powerful, we are long-suffering, but we have a special place in God's heart. We have been chosen where others have not, and in the fullness of time, we will have our, if not revenge, although there is a Jewish tradition of that too, but we will have our reward from God. For Jews to hear, we're not powerful, we're not wealthy compared to others, we don't run countries or empires compared to others. And on top of that, now this Spinoza comes along and says, we're not even special in the way we had been telling ourselves that we're special. We're not particularly chosen. That really hit quite hard. And that was something sort of the third rail. When I said, Jews like debate, almost everything's up for debate. There are certain things, though, that are very problematic. When you turn to your Jewish brethren and say, none of us are special in the way we think we're special, that's almost always going to be greeted with some resistance. So I want to look down here at the second paragraph, excuse me, the second page we have here on the right-hand side of this column. The paragraph that starts up here, however, although we assert that Moses was speaking to the understanding of the Hebrews in the passages of the Pentateuch just quoted, we do not mean to deny that God ordained those laws in the Pentateuch for them alone, nor that he spoke only to them, nor that the Hebrews witnessed marvels such have never befallen any other nation. He sort of backtracks a little here and says, I'm not saying the Bible is completely false. I'm not saying that the Hebrews of the Bible, this would be considered the Jews, right? The Jews would see of the 17th century would see that as their ancestral background, that they didn't have a specific relation to God via the prophet Moses. But Spinoza follows, our point is merely this, that Moses wished to admonish the Hebrews in a particular way, using such reasoning as would bind them more firmly to the worship of God, having regard to the immaturity of their understanding. In other words, the Torah looks the way it does because Moses was trying to speak in a language that his audience would understand. Further, we wish to show that the Hebrews surpass other nations not in knowing or in piety. Jews aren't more knowledgeable and they're not holier or more pious than other groups, but in quite a different respect. Or, I'm going to skip the allusion here, that the Hebrews were chosen by God above all others, not for the true life, nor for any higher understanding, but for a quite different purpose. What the purpose is, I shall now proceed to demonstrate. And in the next few pages, he goes on to a fairly long discussion of what he means by this. But Tani, if you can help skip us on to page 91, which is that next page. There we are. Page 91 here at that long paragraph that starts through this alone. He rejoins, I'm going to sort of skip through some of his examples and rejoin the argument. Through this alone, then, do nations differ from one another, namely, in respect of the kind of society and laws under which they live and are governed. Differences are not in one group is holier than another group, or one group is closer to God because God recognizes their piety. It's not because one group is destined for heaven or for salvation or for redemption and other groups are not, but rather different groups of people, different nations, only differ in the kind of society and laws that they have. Thus, the Hebrew nation was chosen by God before all others, not by reason of its understanding, nor its spiritual qualities, but by reason of its social organization and the good fortune whereby it achieved supremacy and retained it for so many years. Here, and really throughout this paragraph and on to the next page, Spinoza is going to make a fairly interesting exegetical argument here, that when God chose the ancient Hebrews to give his covenant, to enter into a relationship with them, to give them laws, as we see in the Torah, it was because God looked around and said, this particular society is ready for this relationship with God. God saw them as having the social organization that was ready to enact or follow God's laws. And that was it. It wasn't that God chose the most pious group in the ancient Near East. It wasn't that God chose the most important group or the holiest group or the group that God knew would have a great destiny. but rather God looked at them and said, okay, this is a group that's primed and ready to receive this Torah. And that's it. Social and legal organization is what really set the Hebrews apart and nothing else. Further down here, he continues sort of maybe 10 lines up from the bottom here, where it says, therefore, their election. Therefore, and he's talking about the ancient Hebrews. And if you're a 17th century Jew, you're talking about the Jews. Therefore, the Jews' election and vocation consisted only in the material success and prosperity of their state, nor do we see that God promised anything other than this to the patriarchs and their successors. God only promised that you guys have your act together, you have a state and a political organization that's ready for these laws. I will therefore give you these laws for better government. And that is the only reason that I'm talking to you right now. That is the only thing I'm promising you right now. Not eternal redemption, not a special spot in the fullness of time, in the great scope of human history, but rather for here and now, you seem to be ready for this, and therefore I will give you this here and now. By now, those Jews reading along in the 17th century are fuming. What he's saying is, there's nothing special about you. The one thing that you thought was special about you is that you were God's few chosen, has now just been said, that's not true at all. But more to the point, this is not given to you. This was given to the ancient Hebrews. In a minute, we're going to see that disconnect, perhaps, between the ancient Hebrews that appear in the Bible and the Jews of 17th century Amsterdam, who saw themselves as tied to these ancient Hebrews by an eternal covenant with God. That covenant is not quite as eternal as they think, according to our writer Spinoza. And here I want to take a look at page 94, Tani, if you can bring us up to 94. Thank you. After a long discussion of the points we just went over, he comes to a little mini conclusion midway through his chapter, and he says in a long paragraph on page 94, we therefore conclude, and I'm going to skip a little bit here, that the individual Jew, considered alone apart from his social organization and his government, possesses no gift of God above other men, and there is no difference between him and a Gentile. This sort of takes that next step, that what I was talking about the ancient Hebrews is only being chosen by God. The Torah was only given to them because they were Torah ready. They were ready to receive the Torah. That does not have anything to do with you Jews living in Amsterdam or anywhere else in the 17th century modern world, right? This was something given to a collective at a time that collective had meaning. That collective no longer exists, and no individual Jew considered apart from that collective can claim any chosenness whatsoever. There is no difference between the Jew and the Gentile as far as God is concerned. This is not something a Jewish leader wants to hear when he's trying to figure out how to keep his kids Jewish, especially in a world, right, where it's a cosmopolitan city. You can be a variety of different religions. But it's also in a community, the Sephardic community, where most of these Parnasim have cousins still in Portugal who are Catholic. Most of these Jewish leaders have cousins or relatives somewhere in the world who are Catholic and have not reverted back to Judaism. Most of them have friends and neighbors who've moved to Amsterdam and didn't revert to Judaism, moved to Amsterdam, moved back to Lisbon, moved to the New World, moved to London. Sometimes they're Jewish, sometimes they're not. This is not a Jewish community that is quite as firm in its Jewish identity as perhaps others in the world are. And so this idea that you're telling your kids, well, you know, the smartest guy in town says, really, the Torah doesn't tell us that Jews are the chosen people, and the Torah doesn't say there's any particular difference between an individual Jew and an individual non-Jew. why do I have to go to Sunday school, Daddy? Why do I have to keep kosher then? Why do I have to be Jewish? Becomes a more difficult question than it had been even normally. It's a difficult question always, but it's even more difficult when Spinoza comes out and says what he says here. Jumping over to page 95, where he's continuing here, he says at the top of the main paragraph there, therefore, there is no doubt that other nations, like the Jews, also had their prophets who prophesied to them and to the Jews. And then he talks about scripture saying only one person, perhaps Balaam, fills this role. He's in a minute about to do something that no rabbi really wants to see a Jew do when he's interpreting Torah. And that's, as we move on to page 97, that's quoting the New Testament and Christian sources. So Tani, if you can push us on to page 97, thank you very much. The top of that main paragraph of the page where he says, however, right there, he's going to look at Paul's letter to the Romans, a very sort of influential and much debated book among Christian scholars, a book of the New Testament of the Bible. Clearly, we see here that, like many people in his background who had a foot in the Christian world, Spinoza had a background in Christian texts as well as in Jewish texts. And although the aforementioned Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel tutored young Spinoza, clearly Spinoza also read Christian texts, including the Christian Bible, and quotes it quite freely. He argues that Paul's letter to the Romans, I find another text which carries more weight with me, and he goes about which chapters, etc. And we'll scroll down to this point he says here about mid-paragraph. For in verse 29 of the same chapter, he says that God is the God of both Jews and Gentiles. This is Paul saying this. And in chapter 2, verses 25 through 26, Paul writes, if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. On the other hand, if uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, the uncircumcision shall be counted for circumcision. The argument here, and he says this, Paul says this throughout the letter to the Romans, it doesn't matter if you keep kosher or you don't keep kosher. If keeping kosher works for you, do it. If it works for your friend, leave your friend alone. Some people keep the old laws in the letter of the law. Some people keep them in the spirit of the law. It really doesn't matter. God is the God of Jews and Gentiles alike. Just because you keep kosher and are circumcised doesn't make you saved. It doesn't make you beloved by God, because if you get circumcised and then break the spirit of God's law, the circumcision doesn't mean anything. Keeping kosher and not really keeping the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, you might as well not keep kosher. This is something that's Jewish authors have been debating with Christian scholars for centuries since this was written in the late antique period. This used as a proof text to say there really is no organic difference between Jews and Christians. That the only difference that Jews had was that long ago in the biblical period, God chose them and singled them out for a set of laws because he thought they were ready for those laws to enact in their society. That was quite a statement to hear. It meant that the Jews of 17th century Amsterdam really didn't have any claim to superiority over their counterparts. Keeping an eye here on the time, and I want to go through a couple more things in the text before we move on. Spinoza gives us a little bit of a look into his personal background here towards the end of the chapter. And I want to take a look at that. And that's on page 99, Tani, if you want to sort of scroll down to that page on the bottom of 99 on the left there. The last paragraph here says, as to their continued existence. So if this is true, if Jews were only given the covenant or sort of a special relationship with the divine in a particular time, in a particular place, and therefore, once the temple is destroyed, once the Jews are kicked out of their homeland, that covenant is broken. That the Jews were chosen for a time and a place, and that time and the place are no longer relevant. What does that mean for Judaism in the then modern world? How are people still Jews when in fact their brief, their role in the world has been essentially torn up? He writes at the bottom of page 99, as to their continued existence for so many years, when scattered and stateless, this is in no way surprising, since they have separated themselves from other nations to such a degree as to incur the hatred of all. And this is not only through the external rites alien to the rights of other nations, but also through the mark of circumcision, which they most religiously observe. And he'll get into circumcision on the next page. But his argument here is, so you might ask, why are there still Jews if Jewishness really was something established in a particular time, in a particular place for our ancient ancestors, but not for us? Well, he argues, Jews still exist as Jews because of their stubbornness and because of anti-Semitism, essentially. Something that has also garnered a lot of interest from people in the last few centuries. Spinoza is saying, through their external rites, like circumcision, although you could also say like kashrut, like other things that the Sabbath observance that separate Jews away from their neighbors who are non-Jews, that's something that they have sort of clanishly enforced. And therefore, Jews have forced themselves to stay together even after their reason for staying together has dissipated in diaspora. But more than that, that clannishness has angered everyone around them. And the Jews have kept together because they have created a hostile climate for themselves, right? Anti-Semitism really is something that at its root, he doesn't use the term anti-Semitism, but problems with the Jews at its root is something that Jews have created for themselves. It continues, that they are preserved largely through the hatred of other nations is demonstrated by historical fact. And he's going to give you two examples that make sense to him. And Tanya, we're going to finish this line and go on to the next page. When the king of Spain formerly compelled the Jews to embrace, and we're flipping, to embrace the religion of his kingdoms, or else go into exile, a considerable number of Jews accepted Catholicism. This is true. Many Jews did accept Catholicism rather than exile in 1492. He continues, now, since all the privileges of native Spaniards were granted to those who embraced their religion, and they were then considered worthy of full civic rights, they were so speedily assimilated to the Spanish that after a short while, no trace of them was left, nor any remembrance. I would argue that's not exactly true, that in fact, to this day, there are some traces and memories of Jewish Spain left there. But his point was, hey, by the 17th century, there are plenty of former Jews living in Spain, and they're mixed in with everyone else, despite the efforts of the Inquisition to root them out. But he continues, just the opposite fate befell those whom the King of Portugal compelled to embrace his country's religion. So when the King of Portugal converted the Jews, something else happened. Although converted Jews to this religion, converted to this religion, they lived on their own because the king declared them unworthy of civic rights. So in the Spanish conversion scenario, hold on a minute, I've clicked out. In the Spanish conversion scenario, Spain said, once you convert, you get full rights. You can hold land, you can become bishops of the church, you can marry old Christians, it's not a problem. The Portuguese king was a little bit different. He said, we are not so sure that we want to get rid of our Jews, but we're also not so sure we want to include them fully in our society. So we convert them, but we keep them apart from society. Whether this is historically accurate or whether the converted Jews in Portugal kept themselves apart is open for some contemporary debate among my colleagues. But Spinoza's argument is when the Jews are allowed to assimilate, they do. When the Jews are not allowed to assimilate, they don't. But this has nothing to do with God's chosenness. This has to do with policies of lords in the world and the way those things work out. Any questions on this? Okay, so before we get into questions, I'm going to ask, we'll do one more thing before we do this. We might as well. He mentions that the mark of circumcision in the next paragraph. This is, I hesitate to do this because it's a very debated paragraph on what he actually means. But he argues that in this middle paragraph on 100, the mark of circumcision too, I consider to be such an important factor in this matter that I am convinced that this by itself will preserve their nation forever. So here he sort of plays anthropologist. It's not belief. It's not love of Torah. It's not halacha and following the dictates of our ancestors assiduously that keeps Jews Jewish. It's our quirky ceremonial rites, such as circumcision, that even if you don't follow halacha in other ways, and even if you don't really believe in God, and even if you cheat on your taxes and you're not a good Jew, as long as we all keep circumcising our sons, we will remain a people apart. And as long as we remain a people apart, there's a chance for us to once again regain the state that we once had, or at least that the ancient Hebrews once had of a country and nation and a state apart. He writes, indeed, were it not that the fundamental principles of their religion discourage manliness, another translation is effeminate them, make them effeminate, I would not hesitate to believe that they will one day, given the opportunity, such as the mutability of human affairs, establish once more their independent state, and that God will again choose them. So you can imagine there's a Zionist reading of this starting in the 19th and 20th centuries that, God helps those who help themselves. If we continue to separate ourselves from the world, eventually we'll have a point where we will regain our own state, and by regaining our own political state, regain God's favor. That God's favor is tied, as it was in the ancient Hebrews case, to the Jews being ready to receive the Torah and operate on it. That such is the immutability of human affairs, that sometime, if Jews can get by their lack of manliness, or whatever that line means, if they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and tighten their belts, so to speak, Jews can once again fight for political independence, establish a state, and therefore receive the sort of blessings that their ancestors received. But here and now in 17th century Amsterdam, that does not exist. Okay, Tani, if you can sort of stop sharing and we'll bring it back here. Thank you very much. We'll pause again here for some more questions, then we'll finish up and then we'll open up fully to Q&A.
I will just say I'm glad we have a second session on Spinoza because there are a lot of questions.
I'm sure.
Okay, there were several questions trying to clarify an issue about his theology, which I will kind of sum up as follows. If God is nature with no will, and all the personification and human traits are all a human projection, then how does it make sense for him to be talking about God as someone who promises, chooses, judges, gives the Torah, etc.?
Right. So this is often brought up. His argument is, and I am blending his arguments in this particular treatise with arguments in the ethics and other treatises he has. He is arguing that he is going to use the terminology of the Bible to explain what the Bible means. But he says that terminology was run through Moses as a means to communicate with humans. So I will speak to you, my audience, the way Moses spoke to his, using the common terms of gendered language and pronouns, et cetera, but really, and he goes, if you read, I didn't read every line of the text, but if you read earlier on in this chapter, he does basically say, first, let me lay out what I mean by God's internal will and external will. And when a human being has an idea, that's an example of one thing. And when God directly reveals God's self to humans, that's another matter. So that you could talk about this in the modern way, you might say, human impulses and psychology versus environmental science or physics. Both of these are expressions of what Spinoza calls God. But he's using the terminology and the language that was familiar to his audience at the time. And he sets that up early on to explain what he means when he uses these terms.
Okay, thank you. Many people also asked about comparisons to Maimonides, especially in the rejection of anthropomorphism, and wanted to know if Spinoza was influenced by Maimonides.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, Spinoza definitely reads and is influenced by Maimonides probably more than any other Jewish thinker in his sort of rationalism. But I must say, most Jewish thinkers reject anthropomorphism. I mean, there's this question of the resurrection of the human body, but that's not what we're talking about. God doesn't have feet for most Jewish thinkers, right? God, the idea of we say God saw and God loved, these are understood to be human expressions and not really understood in a literal sense that God must have eyes if we say that God saw, or that God had an outstretched arm. We don't really think in the anthropomorphized term of a human arm. So he was someone who read Maimonides, but I don't think you had to read Maimonides. I can't think of any Jewish thinker that at that time who would argue for an anthropomorphized view of God. Even the mystics, right? If you read the Zohar and we talk about mystic coupling, right? Mystic coitus, it's understood in a different way than that the Shekinah actually is embodied the way a female is embodied.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm just trying to go in groupings of questions. So people were curious kind of how he got to this point. What was his education like? And was it Jewish, was it Christian, or at what point did it switch from one to the other? And someone was also raising an idea, I guess, that he was the rabbinic prodigy at some point with the chief rabbi of Amsterdam, and then kind of made this huge break. Right.
So you can't think of like what high school did he go to, right? These are people who were independently homeschooled and tutored, right? Or you studied with people in various ways, whether you sat with them or whether they handed you a few books and saw you in 3 months. There's a variety of different ways of studying. So he clearly received a Catholic education when he was younger and continued to read Catholic works, which were readily available. This is, remember, after the printing press, books are available for purchase individually at that time. He did study with, I said, Manasseh ben Israel. I don't know if you would call him the chief rabbi. He was a significant, the most significant rabbinical authority of Amsterdam at the time. The idea that he was a good student who went wrong, right? That he was in the Manasseh ben Israel yeshiva and then started smoking in the back room and then broke away. That's not what we were looking at. Clearly, he's a voracious reader. He's a prodigy. I mean, he's reading tons of stuff throughout his young teenage years. He's writing these major works that we're still reading today in his late 20s, early 30s. So he's kicked out of the Jewish community at age 23. We have to imagine that he is already, well known for his ideas, even though he hadn't published a word. He's obviously saying this openly enough for him to get brought into the principal's office, brought into the community ma'amad's office, given the chance to repent, and when he doesn't take it, then kicked out. So one would have to imagine that he's constantly thinking, constantly discussing this with others. He's also not the only guy who's in trouble with the Ma'amad. He's the most famous, but Uriel da Costa is another who doesn't have the fame in the 21st century that Spinoza does, but certainly did in the 17th. And he's someone who's put into harem several times as well. So there are a lot of what might be called free thinkers who read Jewish sources, read non-Jewish sources, and came to conclusions that were at odds with the powers that be at that time. Not just rabbinical powers, but the rich and powerful who ran the society.
Do you want to take some more?
Why don't we actually do this? So I'm looking at time. Why don't I just do a very short conclusion here? We'll wrap up and then we can open up to any questions and have a little discussion if that works for you.
Great.
All right. So in many ways, this idea that we're talking about right here of a converso background, or someone who isn't cloistered within the Jewish world, but really is open to the influences of the non-Jewish world, in part because his family has origins in the non-Jewish world and later comes to embrace the Jewish world, is something of a harbinger for the effects of modernity on to the Jewish world. Those of you who know a little bit about modern Jewish history, there's this narrative we have of Jews are in the shtetl, Jews are, in the yeshiva, Jews are in the Jewish quarter. They're sort of cloistered. They're separate in many ways from the Jewish world, with some important points of contact. But generally, Jews live in their cities, their neighborhoods. And slowly, over the course of this period we know as emancipation, Jews are enfranchised in stages into the modern European and American world. And to the point that we have many Jews today in the United States who go to public school with non-Jews and live in neighborhoods with non-Jews and watch the same television and open to the same influences as non-Jews, and privately on the side have their Jewish world, their Jewish summer camps, their Sunday school, their Hebrew school, their shul, etc. And that almost every synagogue I know of in America and a lot of families worry about that balance. How do you integrate into the modern world and retain your Jewishness and retain a sense of difference, a sense of purpose, a sense of community, a sense of history, a sense of dedication to Jewish law and tradition? Spinoza really becomes one of the sort of early exemplars of this problem that will become so universal in the following centuries. That here is someone who says, you allow me or tell me to read these Christian books, and then you tell me to be Jewish. But I have to say, I'm trying to square these two worlds you've opened me to, and I'm having trouble. I think that, and if you look at the very end of the Tractatus, his last chapter, he basically says, nobody has the right to tell you what kind of religion you should be. Nobody, certainly not the state. There shouldn't be Protestant cities and Catholic cities. You shouldn't have a mod telling you, Spinoza, this is what it means to be Jewish, and if you don't like it, you'll no longer be Jewish. You don't have to want to accept me or play with me, but no one gets to kick me out of Judaism, right? He failed. He was effectively kicked out of the Jewish world. But his argument there is nobody should have the right, except for the individual, to decide what religion you are. The state, the ma'amad, the communal council, can't effectively make you Jewish or not Jewish. That's something that deals with deeper connections to the divine as one understands the divine. And that line, that idea of freedom of conscience, is really a proto-Enlightenment notion that gets picked up by many more Enlightenment thinkers in the next century, and really is with us today. How do you, without being bullies, without saying you're Jewish or else, without saying you toe the line or we'll kick you out of the Jewish world, how do you allow for freedom of conscience and allow for free will and encourage, without being a bully, without using harem 50 times a year, participation in the Jewish world along certain lines? How do you effectively control the limits of the Jewish world? When in many ways, Spinoza is arguing there's no logical leg to stand on by saying, I get to decide whether Julia or Tani is Jewish or not, right? And that has struck a chord with many free-thinking Jews for centuries now. I will decide what my relationship to the divine is and what my relationship to the Jewish world and Jewish past is, not the synagogue board of my local synagogue. Spinoza was probably someone who the Ma'amad wanted to bring back rather than shun forever. The Cherem almost always had the desired effect because no one wanted to be a pariah. Spinoza, in part because of his stubbornness, in part because of his fame, found a way to live between religious communities. He didn't convert to Catholicism or to any kind of Protestant denomination. He stayed Spinoza, and he wasn't shunned completely. People did feed him. People did house him. People did, talk with him. So he was one of the first major figures we know of who showed the limits of the Cherem. The Cherem only really works if people are scared of being cut adrift from all communities. In fact, this idea that what happens if I say, you'll do what I want or I'll divorce you, and someone says, okay, so divorce me. That he was really sort of the first major figure for that to happen and the Jewish community really not in the 1600s, but over time in the next few centuries had to come to other means of cajoling support from their Jews rather than just saying it's our way or the highway. So in that way, Spinoza becomes sort of an important figure for the future of Jewish history, showing that not only is debate and dissent a part of the Jewish world, but that if the powers that be don't like dissent, they have to come up with a way of engaging Jews other than kicking them out. Because in the modern world, there are just going to be too many other options for these free-thinking Jews as far as where to land. Okay, and that's our little beat on Spinoza for today. I'm happy to open it up for any questions you might have via Julia. So thank you very much.
All right, so you just kind of pivoted us to the perspective and the motivations of the community at the end there, which is where we also had a lot of questions. So so maybe we can just focus on that for a bit. There's just a lot of questions about what really was motivating the community to put him in Cherem. Did he actually have followers? Was he having an impact? How much of this was coming from religious authorities versus secular authorities that may have been more concerned with economic matters? How much did the Parnasim see what he was saying about chosenness or lack thereof as a critique of them and their authority? So, a bunch of questions.
Right, these are all great questions. I would think about it this way, and I sort of started out this way. Doesn't matter what a rabbi thinks. Not in 17th century Amsterdam, right? They are not invited into the room where it happens. Like these are the movers and shakers, not to say that those movers and shakers never studied Talmud. Some of them were learned, but they weren't scholars in the way that Manasseh ben Israel was a scholar, some of these other great scholars we think of, right? These were merchants with great power, and they were the ones who decided who got Cherem and who didn't. When they needed to, they found rabbinic support. They had rabbis on retainer, right? They had people they could go to who supported them and were like-minded. And if they were not like-minded, they were threatened. And if they weren't threatened, they would find someone else. They would find some young rabbinical student who would say what they wanted to say. So if they needed the imprimatur of scholars, they could always find it. But really, this was a community, and like many other communities in Jewish history, that was run by the rich and powerful, and that used rabbinic experts, legal experts, to their advantage when they needed to, although most of them didn't need to. There were a lot of them that said, I don't need to refer to anyone. If I say we're kicking this guy out, we're kicking this guy out. So when we talk about the community, we're really talking about a very small number of very powerful men. And they decided that this was someone who not only was saying things that they personally didn't want to hear, but also something that they had been told would not be acceptable to the Christian authorities who allowed them to stay in the city, right? This is a moment of conservative government in the Estates General in Amsterdam, who said, listen, there's no way we're letting upstart Jews go unpunished, because then we're in trouble in our own community from our own upstarts, and we're not having a Descartes or a Spinoza coming up from our community. So you make sure you don't have any problems that bring us to your door. And I think the Jewish leaders, A, understood that without being told, and B, we're on board with that. You can't just say these were liberal Jews who were scared of their Protestant overlords. These were like-minded Jewish leaders who also thought, like their Protestant overlords, we don't accept any dissent within our ranks.
Okay, so it was as much about concern about the Christian authorities as being threatened, feeling threatened themselves. So a few people have raised the parallel of Messianic Jews today, which I think maybe is an apt one, or I guess people are curious to hear if you think it is. Right, like you can say that there's you could present a theological or sort of religious problem with the view, but a lot of the opposition is really much more for communal and identity and kind of the fabric of what holds us together and history, like those kinds of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's hard. I don't think so. In the things you're pointing to, you might make an interesting parallel between Messianic Jews. I don't think mainstream Jewish communities in the United States or Israel sweat Messianic Jews all that much, right? I think there was a concern with someone like Spinoza. If Messianic Jews, maybe the opposite, Messianic Jews were some of the evangelical Christians who are now operating in the state of Israel. People who make comments about the nature of Jewishness, all sorts of people make them. There are a lot of eye rolling and people might dismiss you as a crackpot. If, however, you have numbers and authority behind you, now you become a problem I have to actually contend with. And I think that's what we're talking about, right? Someone who's being read widely by the most important people of Europe, who's Jewish from Amsterdam, that's a problem. Some kid in the street corner who says, I don't have to keep kosher, you kind of shrug him off a little bit more.
So he was having a real impact on how people were thinking about Jewishness.
Well, I mean, you have to imagine, for better or worse, at some point he becomes something of an intellectual celebrity. And for the Christians, he's Jewish. Even after he's kicked out of the Jewish community, he's Jewish, right? He's that Jewish guy who is kicked out of the Jewish community, right? And so to have your most prominent thinker of the age, back when thinkers was a thing, back when philosophers was an important thing, to have him say these things in Latin for everyone to read was problematic. He's not like a standing on his soapbox in the street corner where everyone's ignoring him. He's someone who has a readership of the most prominent people in the world at the time.
So there were questions about kind of the shifts in reception of Spinoza, in the intervening time, which actually is really what next week's session is about. So I'm just letting people know. That's why I'm not raising those. But I guess there were a lot of questions about contemporary parallels, and I'm curious to know, as someone who really gets all the social dynamics around this and the historical forces, where do you see parallels? Are there, we have, and one of the things that I think is noteworthy about, or obvious, but just worth saying about Spinoza compared to some of our other sessions, right? We're talking not about the censoring of a book, but about a person, right? And you sort of can't not go to the cancel culture question, and so. Yeah, what do you have to say about?
I think that's interesting, right? I mean, I don't want to step on your next speaker who will be talking about the life of Spinoza up until today. But yeah, I think all of these things bring to mind, I'll say, who owns Jewish history, right? Who owns Jewish identity? Who gets, Jews pat themselves on the back. I started out by saying, Jews, we like to pat ourselves on the back that say, we like dissent. We debate, grab a chavrusa, right? Grab a teacher and a student, always work things out, always be wrestling with these deep, difficult issues, which is, I think, a wonderful thing. And I think a wonderful thing that we keep liking it. But there's also, it raises certain questions. At the end of the day, what if I disagree with my chavrusa? Do I get to kick her out or him out? Who gets to cancel whom? There's issues for that in diaspora Judaism. It's a slightly different question in the state of Israel, where you have a formal empaneled government of a state. What is the role of the government of the Jewish state with regard to Judaism and the Jewish religion? These are all really interesting questions that we have. And we can say, well, the state doesn't really have any role. Well, the state does decide in Israel who gets to immigrate, who doesn't, who gets to be called a Jew, who doesn't, who gets to marry, how they get to marry, laws of divorce, inheritance, right? These things are tied up with these groups. So whether it's the ma'amad then, or the council of your local shul, or the rabbinic assembly, or the RCA, if you're in modern Judaism, or whoever, we do have these groups that we say speak for us, whoever the us is, Reform Judaism, Modern Orthodoxy, Chabad, whatever it is. What happens when I support them until they say something about my daughter that I don't like? Then do they have the right to call her not a Jew? These are all interesting questions, and hopefully someone else will answer them in your next session.
So, right. So we have these. There's a lot of this painful kind of, you're outside the pale kind of stuff going on in the contemporary Jewish community, whether from, ultra-Orthodox, Reform isn't Jewish, or huge division about Israel, to the extent that people, just like, I can't be part of the same community as you. You're not part of the same thing. Intermarriage, all these really charged issues. Do you think that? So you talked about how there was, this excommunication tool was used at the time as kind of a deterrent or keeping people in line, but it was so much stronger with Spinoza. Did that kind of kick us off in this direction, or was it sort of out of the ordinary for its time, and we've unfortunately made it more common in our day?
I wouldn't. It certainly didn't start with Spinoza. This has always been part of the Jewish world, right? Cherem and Yidui are part of Jewish law since the ancient period for a reason. Having a community is difficult, right? Having a community that's somewhat democratic is even more difficult, right? Autocracy, if the person in power can hold power, is somewhat streamlined. It may not be moral. It may be upsetting to us for other reasons, but it's at least easier. Democracy is messy. And any kind of democracy, any kind of consensus of any kind is structurally difficult and messy. So I think it's always there. I think that a variety of historical factors led to the harem being used a lot in 17th century Amsterdam. It was a little bit less before that, a little bit less after that in different places. But because I think there were certain pressures on the Amsterdam community in the 17th century that led to that. But I think we wax and wane over time with our comfort level in including or excluding others and dividing ourselves away from others. And I don't know if we're in a waxing or waning period, but yes, there are about to be a lot of arguments over Thanksgiving tables over some of these questions we're talking about in the next few days.
Yeah, it's painful, these dynamics. And maybe just as a last question, you talked about how the chayrim wasn't really, people didn't really follow through on it. People still had him over, kind of thing. Do you think that just to the extent that we know, what was this? How much of a personal blow was this for him? Did it impact what he did in the public sphere?
So it happened when he was young, and he lives another 20 some odd years and gained most of his fame after the Cherem. So it didn't hurt him becoming a household name and publishing and becoming important in that respect. One could say the Jewish community drove him into the arms of the rest of the non-Jewish community, that he becomes more of a celebrity in the Protestant world because they saw him as someone who told the Jews off, and that played well in the salons of the non-Jewish world. I can't tell you whether he cried himself to sleep at night and felt estranged from family and friends in his 30s and 40s. That personal aspect, I don't know. I'm not a biographer as his, but the stuff I read doesn't really go into it. I don't know that we know that answer. I know that it certainly didn't hurt his career, put it that way.
Right. So this, right, what's rejected by one group becomes the celebrity of another group, and I cannot help to think about the midterms and sort of who drives who to the polls, whether in support or opposition. All right, so many continually relevant issues that you've opened up for us with Spinoza. So thank you so much for bring us into the content and also kind of the historical dynamics that made this a moment where this happened. And again, I'm glad that we have another session next week. I want to invite everyone back next week to learn with actually one of our newest members of the faculty here at JTS, Dr. Shira Billet. We'll be talking about Spinoza's reception later on, and how the Jewish community has related to his thought and his work. So we hope to see you back next week after Thanksgiving. And I want to thank once again Beatrice and Harold Jacobson and Berna and Bill Haberman and Rona Solberg for your generous sponsorship of today's session. And we wish everyone a happy and hopefully not too contentious around the table kind of Thanksgiving meal with family and loved ones. And we will see you on the other side. Thanks again to Professor Ray for teaching us today.
Thanks, everybody.